Welcome to this peaceful moment. Here, you will discover stories inspired by the quiet beauty of Japan. Each tale is like a soft breeze through a bamboo grove, carrying you away from the worries of the day. Imagine the scent of blooming cherry blossoms and the gentle flow of a nearby clear stream. Let these words and sounds cradle your mind in calm and serenity. Tonight, permit yourself to drift into a restful sleep. Let us begin this journey together. Snowlight on the old bridge. Snow had been falling since dawn, quiet and steady, as if the sky had decided the world below needed to be softened. By afternoon, the village was wrapped in white roofs. Bowed under its weight, trees lined with delicate frost, and the river that cut through the valley flowing in slow, muffled whispers. At the heart of the village stood the old bridge. Its wood, darkened by years of rain and snow, curved gently over the river, joining the two halves of the settlement. It was older than anyone alive could remember. The elders said it had stood there for over 3 centuries, rebuilt in part but never replaced. On nights of heavy snow, when the lanterns along the road cast faint halos through the falling flakes, the bridge looked less like a man-made structure and more like something that had always been part of the landscape born of the river, shaped by the seasons. Yuki had returned to the village for the first time in 12 years. The capital, with its noise and restless lights, had kept her too busy to think about home. But when her father's letter arrived short, his handwriting as careful as ever, she knew she could not delay. Your mother's health is not what it used to be. Winter will be hard for her this year. She had taken the early train, then the lone bus that wound through the mountains, the snow thickening as the road climbed. By the time she reached the village, her coat was dusted in white. The bridge was the first thing she saw, just as it had been when she was a child returning from school. Something in her chest shifted, a quiet ache she had not expected. Crossing the bridge, Yuki slowed her steps. The snow muffled her boots, each footfall leaving a perfect imprint before the flakes began to fill it again. She paused midway. The river below was a muted ribbon, flowing under a thin glaze of ice. The sound was soft, almost like breathing. The village seemed to hold its breath, as if the snowlight itself had weight and stillness. When she was little, she used to wait here for her grandfather. He would cross from the other side carrying a wicker basket, filled with oranges in winter, persimmons in autumn. He always had a story to tell about the foxes that lived in the hills. The spirits that lingered near the river bank, the way the snow carried messages if you listened closely enough. Snow has its voice, he used to say, brushing flakes from her hair. But only patient ears can hear it. Now the bridge was empty, save for the hush of winter. She tightened her scarf and continued toward the far side, where her parents' house waited. Her mother greeted her with a smile that was both warm and tired. The small house smelled of miso broth and the faint tang of pickled vegetables. They ate together, the conversation meandering like the slow river outside. Her father asked about the city, her work, and the people she had met. Her mother asked nothing, just watched her with eyes that seemed to hold the memory of every year Yuki had been away. After dinner, Yuki stepped outside. The snow had deepened, blanketing the ground so that the old paths were almost invisible. Lantern light glowed in pockets of gold against the white. Drawn by an impulse she could not name, she walked back toward the bridge. The bridge under night snow was another world. The lanterns along its length were dimmed by the falling flakes, each light a muted star in the quiet. Her breath came in small clouds, dissolving into the stillness. Halfway across, she stopped again. And then she heard it faint, barely distinguishable from the sound of snow touching wood. A voice, or perhaps an echo. It wasn't words, not yet, but it was shaped like speech. The same way her grandfather's voice had sometimes seemed to weave itself into the winter air. She closed her eyes. "Welcome home." The words were clear this time, though no one stood nearby. Yuki opened her eyes and turned her head. The far end of the bridge seemed unchanged, just snow, river, lantern glow. But the air was warm against her cheek, as if someone had leaned close. She remembered then the last winter she had spent here, the year her grandfather passed away. They had walked this bridge together the day before the snow came heavily, his steps slower than usual. He had stopped midway, gazing out at the river, and said quietly, "One day, when you return, the bridge will speak to you. Listen, and you'll hear all that was left unsaid." She had laughed then, thinking it one of his whimsical stories. Now, standing alone in the snowlight, she felt the truth of it. The voice didn't come again, but the silence itself seemed fuller, layered with memory, with something that felt like presence. She stayed there until her fingers numbed, then slowly walked back to the house. That night, she dreamed of crossing the bridge in a snowfall that never ended. On the far side stood her grandfather, holding a basket of oranges, smiling as if no time had passed at all. She reached for him, but the snow thickened, and she woke to the pale light of dawn. In the morning, she visited the small shrine by the river, brushing snow from the stone steps. She left an orange there, the way her grandfather used to, and whispered a greeting. The river murmured beneath the bridge, and for a moment, she thought she heard a faint chuckle in the water's song. As she crossed back, the snowlight gleamed on the wooden planks, each flake catching the sun. It was the same bridge, yet not the same. Something in her had shifted. She knew she would leave again, return to the city, to the life she had built. But she also knew the bridge would be waiting, holding the snowlight, the voice, the memory ready to speak again when she came back. And maybe, next time, she would have an answer. Echoes along the temple path. The path to the temple was older than any written record could tell. It began as a narrow strip of earth, winding between cedar and pine, shaded by trees whose roots gripped the mountain as if holding the earth together. Over centuries, it was widened and paved with stone, each slab laid by hands long since returned to the soil. The stones were uneven now, softened by moss, their edges rounded by countless steps pilgrims, villagers, monks, and wanderers whose names had been forgotten, but whose presence lingered like faint echoes in the air. On the first morning of autumn, Aiko stepped onto that path. She had not been back to her hometown in more than a decade. The city had consumed her with its noise and neon light, its hours defined by schedules rather than seasons. But her father's letter, written in his familiar, deliberate hand, had been brief and without embellishment. "Your mother is not well. It would be good if you came before the leaves turn." That was enough. The air on the mountain was different from the city schooler, sharper, scented faintly with cedar resin and earth. The sound of her boots against the stones was muted, as if the path itself were listening. Somewhere above, the faint ringing of a temple bell drifted down through the trees, a sound so distant it could almost be imagined. She remembered this path from her childhood. Every spring, her mother would take her up to the temple for the flower festival. Their hands linked as they climbed, pausing to look at the small stone statues tucked among the trees. The statues were offerings to Jizo, guardian of travelers and children. Her mother would always bow her head briefly before each one. And every summer, she had walked it with her grandfather, who told her that if you were quiet enough, you could hear the footsteps of those who had walked the path long before you. "The mountain keeps their voices," he once said, leaning on his walking stick. "But you have to listen with more than your ears." Now, as Aiko moved deeper along the path, the world seemed to narrow into the sound of her breath. The crunch of leaves beneath her feet, and the slow pulse of the mountain around her. The sunlight was filtered through high branches, falling in shifting patterns on the mossy stones. A crow called from somewhere unseen, its cry echoing against the trunks and vanishing into the distance. She stopped at one of the small wayside shrines, a weathered wooden box on a stone pedestal, its roof bent slightly under the weight of years. Inside, a small statue of Jizo was wrapped in a faded red bib, its surface smoothed by rain and wind. She placed her hands together and bowed, more from instinct than belief. When she straightened, she thought she heard something soft, indistinct, like the murmur of voices carried on the wind. She turned, but the path behind her was empty. Only the trees stood, swaying slightly as if in slow conversation with one another. Her grandfather's voice came back to her. "Sometimes the echoes aren't in the air, they're in you." The climb grew steeper. She passed a place where the stones widened into a small clearing, where pilgrims once rested before the final ascent. There was a wooden bench there now, darkened by rain and years. She sat for a moment, breathing in the cool air. The scent of fallen leaves was rich, almost sweet. It was then she saw the old woman. She was standing a little way down the path, wearing a faded indigo coat, her gray hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When she noticed Aiko, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and began walking toward her. "You've come back," the woman said, as if she'd been expecting her. Aiko hesitated. "Do I know you?" The woman only smiled again. "We've met, in a way. But it doesn't matter. The temple path remembers everyone." Before Aiko could respond, the woman stepped past her, continuing up toward the temple. A few seconds later, Aiko turned to watch her, but the path ahead was empty. She climbed on, trying to tell herself that she had simply imagined the encounter, a trick of the shifting light and her tiredness. Yet the feeling lingered, the sense that she had just passed someone who belonged to the mountain as much as the cedars and stones did. When the final curve of the path came into view, the temple gates rose before her, tall, weathered wood, their beams dark with age. The great bell hung beyond them, its bronze surface etched with characters worn soft by centuries of prayer. A monk in simple robes swept fallen leaves from the entrance, each motion unhurried. Aiko stepped through the gates, bowing her head slightly. Inside, the temple grounds were quiet but not silent. The wind moved through the branches. Somewhere, a stream gurgled softly. It was the kind of quiet that seemed to hold everything, as if sound itself were being cradled. She found her mother sitting on a bench near the garden, wrapped in a shawl. The years had made her smaller, her hair thinner and streaked with silver, but her eyes still dark and clear, lit up at the sight of her daughter. "You made it," her mother said. "I did," Aiko replied, sitting beside her. For a while, they simply looked at the garden together. The maple leaves had begun to turn, their edges kissed with red. A koi pond reflected the pale sky, its surface broken now and then by a ripple from a passing fish. "I used to hear things here," Aiko said at last. "On the path. When I was little." Her mother smiled faintly. "You still can. If you listen." They sat in the cool air until the temple bell rang, deep and resonant, its sound spilling out into the mountains. The echoes rolled away slowly, as if reluctant to leave. The next morning, Aiko rose early and returned to the path alone. The sun was low, and mist clung to the hollows between trees. Every sound seemed sharper, the crunch of frost underfoot, the rustle of a bird's wings, the faint drip of water from a branch. At the same wayside shrine, she stopped again. She closed her eyes. At first, there was only silence. Then very faintly she heard it, footsteps on stone, the murmur of distant voices, the creak of a wooden walking stick. Not all at once, but layered, as if time itself were folding over. And among them, she thought she heard her grandfather's voice, steady and warm. "You found your way back." She opened her eyes. The path ahead was empty, but the air was filled with something unseen, presence, memory, and the quiet weight of belonging. Aiko bowed once more to the Jizo statue before continuing upward, each step falling into rhythm with the many that had come before her. The mountain did not speak in words, but its echoes were clear. And for the first time in years, she was ready to listen. Where the bamboo bends. The bamboo grove had always been a place of quiet revelation. It stretched along the hillside, thin green stalks rising like a forest of whispered secrets. Leaves swayed softly with every breath of wind, creating a sound like faint chimes that the villagers called the bamboo voice. Some said that if one walked the grove at dusk, the echoes of old stories could be heard in the bend of the stalks. Akiko remembered the grove from her childhood, though memory had folded it into something almost unreal. She had been brought there by her grandmother, a woman of few words who walked slowly yet with a certainty that the world would bend gently to her steps. Akiko had followed behind, clutching the hem of her grandmother's kimono, listening to her explanations in fragments. The bamboo bends, but it does not break. You will find your answers where it bends. At the time, the words felt cryptic, and Akiko had only nodded, her small mind unable to grasp their depth. Years later, Akiko returned, drawn by an unexplainable yearning. The city had exhausted her with its lights, its noise, its endless chase for things that never lasted. She carried a small leather journal, hoping that writing might capture some of the calm she remembered from those long-ago walks. Yet, as she stepped into the grove, she realized that the place had not changed at all. The bamboo still bent with the wind, whispering secrets she could almost hear. And the ground was a patchwork of moss and fallen leaves, as though the forest itself kept a record of every footstep ever taken upon it. Akiko's first steps were hesitant, almost ritualistic. She paused often, listening to the soft rustle above her, to the distant call of a bird, to the faint murmur of a brook hidden deeper in the grove. Each sound seemed to align with a memory long buried: the taste of sweet chestnuts her grandmother had roasted, the delicate warmth of the sun on her small hands. The soft murmur of her grandmother's voice as she explained the bending bamboo. At the heart of the grove, a narrow path wound through a denser thicket. The bamboo here leaned more sharply, creating tunnels of green light and shadow. Here, Akiko felt as if she were walking not just through a forest, but through layers of time itself. Each bend in the path was like a folding of memory. One moment, she was a child laughing as she chased the dragonflies. The next, she was an adult, her heart heavy with questions about the life she had left behind in the city. It was on one such bend that she saw him. He was a man in a simple gray robe, tending to the grove with gentle, deliberate movements. His hands brushed over the stalks, trimming them here, tying them there, as if he were speaking to the bamboo directly. He looked up, meeting Akiko's gaze, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. His eyes held a calm, unhurried depth, like the river that flowed silently beyond the grove's edge. "You have returned," he said, his voice a soft echo of the bamboo's rustle. "The grove has waited. I don't know why I came," Akiko admitted, her words catching in the quiet. "I just felt drawn here." He nodded knowingly. The bamboo always knows who needs its shade. And who needs its voice? Over the days that followed, Akiko walked the grove with him. Each morning, they rose before the sun, walking through the dew-soaked bamboo, listening to the wind stories. The man whose name she learned was Haruto taught her to notice the subtleties, the way light shifted on a stalk, the rhythm of a leaf falling, the soft creak of bamboo as it bent under its weight. Akiko began to understand that the bending was not weakness but resilience, a quiet harmony between strength and flexibility. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the grove in a golden haze, Haruto led her to a secluded clearing. There, the bamboo arched to form a natural canopy, and beneath it lay a small stone basin filled with water. He gestured for her to sit. "Look closely," he said. "What do you see in the water?" Akiko peered in. The surface reflected the bamboo, twisted and bending, their images overlapping. At first, she saw only confusion, a tangle of shapes. Then she noticed the patterns. The stalks swayed in unison, each movement affecting the next, yet none breaking. She realized the water mirrored not just the grove, but life itself, connections. The unseen influences, the gentle give and take that allowed the world to persist in harmony. "I think I understand," she whispered. "The bamboo bends because it must, but it also teaches us how to bend without losing ourselves." Haruto smiled. "Yes. And now the grove has shown you its way." In the weeks that followed, Akiko found a rhythm within herself she had long forgotten. She walked the grove daily, recording thoughts in her journal, but also listening to the world around her. She began to notice the small joys, the hum of insects, the scent of wet earth, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Each moment was a thread, weaving together the quiet fabric of her inner life. One night, a storm swept through the grove. Rain fell in torrents, and wind bent the bamboo to almost unnatural angles. Akiko sheltered under a thick stalk, watching as the stalks swayed and creaked, some almost touching the ground before rising again. At first, fear gripped her. But then, she remembered Haruto's words: bending is not breaking. The bamboo endured. And so did she. When the storm passed, the grove was renewed. The leaves glistened with water, the moss was brighter, and the air held a crisp sweetness. Akiko walked the familiar paths, feeling the resilience of the bamboo mirrored within her own heart. She understood now that life's pressures, its sudden storms, its twists and turns, were not meant to destroy, but to teach the art of balance. As she prepared to leave, Akiko realized she no longer needed to escape the city entirely. She carried the grove within her, a quiet sanctuary in her heart. She could hear the bamboo's whispers in the clatter of everyday life. Feel its flexibility when challenges arose, and remember that bending was a strength, not a weakness. The bamboo grove, with its timeless whispers, had taught her that even when paths bend unexpectedly, even when shadows fall and light shifts, there is a harmony that persists if one walks with awareness and grace. And Akiko knew she would return, as the grove always awaited those who listened. Stillness between two waves. The morning tide retreated slowly, leaving the sandy shore glistening with a thin film of water that reflected the pale, awakening sky. Kay stood at the edge of the beach, feeling the chill of the water seep into his bare feet. The waves had been relentless the previous night, crashing against the cliffside with a rhythm both terrifying and mesmerizing, as though the ocean itself were trying to speak. Now, in this brief pause, the world felt suspended between breaths, caught in the stillness between two waves. Kay had come to this remote coast seeking silence. The city behind him was a tangle of noise and duty, of conversations that demanded responses, of lights that never dimmed. Here, the only voices were those of the wind, the distant gulls, and the sea, speaking in a language he could almost understand. He inhaled deeply, the scent of salt and wet sand filling his lungs, grounding him. The villagers called this part of the coast Hain no Umi, the Feather Sea, for the way the waves rose and fell like soft wings. Legend spoke of travelers who lost their way in the mist or heard whispers in the foam, messages from those who had vanished into the depths. Kay was skeptical of stories, yet the air here carried a quiet magic. Even now, as the tide retreated, he felt the weight of centuries pressing gently upon him, urging him to remember what he had forgotten. He walked along the waterline, letting the sand mold beneath his feet, tracing patterns that the next swell would erase. Each step brought memories of his youth, of simpler days when the world had seemed vast and infinite, and yet intimate. He recalled his father, long gone, standing at the shore with the same quiet reverence, teaching him to read the waves. "There is meaning in the pause," his father had said. "Between one wave and the next lies a moment where the world speaks plainly." As the sun climbed, mist hovered over the cliffs like a veil, softening the edges of reality. Kay noticed something glinting near a cluster of tide pools and approached cautiously. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, half buried in sand and seaweed. The box seemed out of place, yet somehow entirely natural here, as though the ocean had left it as a gift or a warning. He picked it up, feeling the worn grooves under his fingers. Inside, he found a collection of folded papers, each inscribed with delicate brushstrokes that told fragments of stories, poems, and sketches of the sea. Reading the first page, Kay felt a strange calm. The words spoke of patience, of observing the patterns of waves, of moments of stillness that revealed the essence of things. They were the words of someone who had lived with the ocean for decades, perhaps a hermit or a poet, someone who had discovered the secret of listening. Days passed, and Kay returned to the same spot each morning. Exploring the tide pools, following the paths the waves had carved in the sand, and reading the notes from the box. Slowly, he began to notice rhythms in the environment that he had overlooked before, the way the wind shifted just before the waves rose. How the gulls' cries changed with the tide, the subtle pulse of the earth beneath his feet. He started to write, filling the remaining pages of the box with his observations, sketches of patterns, and reflections on silence. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant cliffs, the sky, a deep palette of crimson and indigo, Kay noticed movement at the edge of the forest that lined the cliffs. A figure emerged, a woman dressed in flowing white, her hair tangled with sea spray, her gaze steady and serene. She walked with the rhythm of the tide itself, pausing only when the water seemed to whisper her name. Kay's heart tightened not with fear, but with recognition. Somehow, he knew she had always been here, a guardian of the space between waves, a living echo of the stillness he sought. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice blending seamlessly with the wind. "The quiet that lies between each wave?" Kay nodded, unable to speak. He had come to this place seeking silence, yet he realized it was not absence of sound. He sought, but a presence that could only be felt in the careful observation of life's subtle rhythms. The woman smiled, and in that smile was the calm of the ocean at dawn. The unbroken serenity that comes from knowing the world is held together by moments of pause. Over the following weeks, Kay and the woman explored the coast together. They traced hidden inlets, observed the tides, and shared stories of people whom the sea had touched. She taught him how to move with the rhythm of the waves rather than against them. How to embrace the pauses and the silences, understanding that life's greatest truths often came not in the rush of events but in the stillness between them. The box of papers became a shared journal, a living record of their discoveries. Kay wrote of the wind that carried scents from distant lands, of the way moonlight shimmered on the wet sand, of the way the world seemed to fold into itself in the hush of twilight. And as he wrote, he understood that he was weaving himself into the fabric of this place, becoming part of the quiet pulse that connected land, sea, and sky. When winter approached, bringing longer nights and harsher winds, Kay felt a serene acceptance of time's passage. The waves continued their eternal dance, rising and falling, crashing and retreating. But in the stillness between two waves, he had found a truth that would endure beyond seasons and storms, the delicate balance between movement and pause, sound and silence, loss and discovery. Kay stood once more at the edge of the beach, the woman beside him. Together, they watched the tide pull back, leaving the sand gleaming like silver in the pale light. In that fleeting moment, the world held its breath, and Kay understood that the greatest lessons were often found not in the surge of life, but in the quiet that lies between its waves. The sea whispered its eternal song, and Kay, at last, was listening. Whispers of the bamboo grove. The bamboo grove lay silent beneath the pale moonlight, each slender stalk swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Its movement was soft, like a whispered secret shared between old friends. Akiko walked carefully along the narrow path that wound between the tall, green pillars, her footsteps muffled by the soft moss beneath. The scent of earth and bamboo filled the air, a fragrance that seemed almost alive, carrying memories of times long past. She had been coming to this grove since childhood. Her grandmother had brought her here on warm summer evenings, telling tales of spirits that lived among the bamboo, invisible yet always present. "Listen closely," her grandmother would whisper, "and you will hear the bamboo speak." Akiko had thought it a fanciful story then. But now, standing in the quiet embrace of the grove, she wondered if there had been more truth to it than she had realized. A gentle wind passed through, rustling the leaves in a chorus of soft, sighing whispers. Each rustle seemed to carry a voice, delicate and fleeting. Akiko closed her eyes and listened, allowing the sound to wash over her. She felt a strange connection, as if the grove itself were greeting her, welcoming her back after years of absence. Her eyes fell upon a small clearing where the moonlight pooled like silver water. In its center stood an ancient bamboo, its trunk thicker than any she had seen before, its leaves trembling as if caught in a secret conversation. Akiko approached slowly, her heart swelling with a mixture of reverence and longing. She reached out a hand to touch the smooth, cool surface of the trunk, and a shiver ran down her spine. Not from cold, but from an inexplicable sense of presence. She remembered the stories her grandmother told of the grove's guardian spirit, a being that had watched over their village for generations. The spirit had taken the form of bamboo, remaining hidden yet protective, whispering its guidance through the rustling leaves. Akiko had laughed at the tales, but now, under the moon's gentle glow, she felt as if the spirit was near. Suddenly, a soft sound reached her ears, faint but distinct, a human-like sigh carried on the wind. Akiko paused, her breath caught in her chest. The sigh was sorrowful, tinged with hope. She followed it deeper into the grove, each step careful and measured. The bamboo leaned and swayed, opening a subtle path as if guiding her toward some unseen destination. At the far end of the grove, she found a small pond, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting the moon and the bamboo in perfect clarity. Sitting at the water's edge was an elderly man, his kimono blending with the shadows, his hair silver in the moonlight. He looked up at her with gentle eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. "You have returned," he said softly, his voice blending with the rustle of the bamboo. "I have been waiting." Akiko felt a lump in her throat. I didn't know anyone would be here," she whispered. "The grove speaks," he replied. "To those who listen." She sat beside him, and for a long time, neither spoke. They only listened to the whispers of the bamboo, to the gentle ripple of the pond, to the night's quiet rhythm. Akiko felt the weight of years lifting, replaced by a serene clarity. The world outside seemed far away, irrelevant, as if the grove existed in a different dimension where time itself slowed and softened. Finally, the man spoke again. "Do you remember your grandmother?" Akiko nodded. "She brought me here when I was little. She told me stories of spirits and whispers. He smiled faintly. "And did you believe them?" "Not at first," she admitted. "But now I think I understand. The grove remembers," he said. "It remembers every touch, every word, every visitor. It carries their stories, their hopes, their sorrows. And sometimes, it speaks to them back to those who are ready to hear." A breeze passed, stronger now, lifting the bamboo leaves in a gentle dance. The sound was like hundreds of tiny voices speaking at once, harmonizing in a quiet, eternal melody. Akiko closed her eyes and let it fill her senses. She felt her grandmother's presence, warm and reassuring, and the protective gaze of the guardian spirit that had watched over her family for generations. "Why have you been waiting?" she asked softly. "To remind those who have forgotten," he replied. "To remind them that the world is alive, that the trees, the wind, the water, and even the silence have voices of their own. And when you are ready, you will hear them too." Akiko nodded, feeling tears blur her vision. She had spent so many years chasing the noise and haste of life, forgetting the quiet truths whispered in simple things. Now, she understood that the grove's whispers were not just stories or legends, they were lessons in patience, in listening, in being present. The elderly man rose slowly, his figure merging with the shadows of the grove. "Return when you need guidance," he said. "But remember, you carry the grove within you, wherever you go." As he disappeared, Akiko remained by the pond, watching the reflection of the moon dance on the water. The bamboo rustled in the wind, carrying their whispers to her ears once more. And for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace, a part of something enduring, delicate, and beautiful. Hours passed like moments, and when Akiko finally rose to leave, the first light of dawn had begun to filter through the bamboo. The grove seemed to sigh, as if in farewell, and yet she knew it was only a temporary parting. She stepped onto the path that would lead her back to the village. Carrying the gentle whispers with her, a quiet song of the bamboo that would remain in her heart forever. The bamboo grove remained, silent to the casual observer, yet alive with countless voices. And anyone who took the time to walk its paths, to listen with patience and love, would hear them whispers of the past, guidance for the present, and hope for the future, all carried softly on the wind through the bamboo. Akiko knew she would return, as she always had, drawn by the invisible threads that bound her to this sacred place. And in her heart, she carried the understanding that silence itself could speak louder than any words. Petals drifting on the wind. The village lay nestled in a quiet valley, embraced by the gentle slopes of mountains, and the eternal murmur of a river that wound its way through fields and groves. In spring, when the days grew warmer, the cherry blossoms unfurled their fragile petals, tinting the world with shades of pale pink and white. For those who lived there, this season was not only a celebration of beauty, but also a reminder of the fleeting nature of time, for blossoms never stayed long. They arrived in splendor, lingered briefly, and then drifted away on the wind. Aiko, now in her late 30s, had returned to the village after years spent in the city. Her parents' house had stood empty since they passed away, and though she had delayed her return, something about the spring this year had called her back. She arrived just as the cherry trees began to bloom, their branches trembling with the weight of countless petals. Walking along the familiar path, she felt the hush of memory rising with each step. The same blossoms she had once run beneath as a child, catching falling petals in her palms, now seemed older. Their voices softer, as though they whispered not only to her but to the whole of time. That evening, she sat on the veranda of her old home, gazing out toward the garden where her father had planted a cherry tree the year she was born. Its trunk was thicker now, the bark marked by years of wind and rain, but its blossoms still glowed against the twilight sky. She reached out her hand, catching a petal as it fluttered down, and remembered how her father used to say, "Petals on the wind carry stories. If you hold one long enough, it may tell you something." She closed her eyes, pressing the petal to her palm. And for a moment, she thought she heard a faint voice, a memory of laughter, perhaps, or her mother's gentle humming while she sewed by the fire. It vanished almost as quickly as it came, leaving behind only the hush of evening. The following morning, Aiko walked to the river bank where a long row of cherry trees stretched out like guardians of the water. Villagers gathered there every year to celebrate Hanami, spreading blankets and sharing food beneath the blossoms. Though many faces had changed since her youth, some elders remained, their hair now silver but their eyes still bright. They greeted her warmly, recalling her parents and telling stories she had half forgotten. As the day passed, the wind picked up, sending cascades of petals swirling through the air. Children ran laughing, chasing after them, while the elders sat quietly, sipping tea and watching. Aiko sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the drifting petals. They moved with such grace, surrendering to the breeze, never resisting, always finding a place to rest in water, on stone, in the folds of a kimono. She wondered if life was meant to be lived the same way, not by clinging, but by yielding, trusting that the wind would carry you where you belonged. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered back to the garden. Moonlight spilled across the earth, illuminating the blossoms until they glowed with an otherworldly radiance. She stood beneath the tree her father had planted, and once again, petals fell like silent snow. She lifted her face to them, feeling their soft touch on her skin. And again, a memory stirred her parents' voices, mingled now with others she could not name, a chorus of all who had lived and loved in this place. In that moment, Aiko understood. The petals drifting on the wind were not merely fragile remnants of beauty. They were vessels of memory, carrying with them the stories of those who had come before. Every spring, when they returned, they wove those stories into the living, reminding them that nothing was ever truly lost. The days passed quietly. Aiko began tending to the house and garden, sweeping fallen petals, trimming branches, and repairing shutters. Though the tasks were simple, she found comfort in them. Each act felt like a way of speaking with her parents, of continuing the life they had once lived here. Sometimes she would pause, watch the petals drifting across the yard, and feel as though they were guiding her, teaching her how to live more gently, more fully, with less fear of loss. Toward the end of the season, as the blossoms thinned and green leaves began to replace them, Aiko returned to the riverbank. The ground was blanketed in petals, soft as snow, and the air was filled with the murmur of water. She sat there alone, letting the wind carry strands of hair across her face, and she whispered, "I will stay." It was not a decision made out of obligation or loneliness, but of recognition that this place, with its blossoms and its silences, was where she belonged. She would live here, not to preserve the past, but to walk with it, to let it drift with her like petals on the wind. And so, as the last blossoms fell, Aiko felt no sorrow. She knew they would return, as they always did, carrying with them the voices of memory and the promise of renewal. For in every drifting petal was a reminder that life, though fleeting, was never empty, that even in departure, there was beauty, and in every ending, the beginning of another story. Moonlight over the quiet garden. The garden lay silent beneath the pale silver of the moon. Its stones, arranged long ago by hands that now returned to the earth, seemed to breathe in the stillness of night. The pond reflected the round face of the moon, rippling slightly whenever a breeze stirred across the water's surface. To the casual passerby, it was just an old garden tucked behind a forgotten house in the countryside. Yet for Aya, who had returned after decades away, it was a vessel of memory, carrying the weight of her childhood, her family, and the stories she thought she had left behind. Aya had lived in the city for nearly 30 years. The noise of trains, the glow of neon signs, the endless rhythm of footsteps and voices on crowded streets had formed the fabric of her life. She had not thought often of the garden, nor of the house where she had grown up. When her parents passed away, the place had fallen into disrepair, visited only by the wind and the rain. And yet, something unexplainable had drawn her back this spring, an ache in her chest, a whisper that would not leave her. When she first stepped onto the stone path that led through the overgrown gate, the garden seemed almost to sigh in recognition. The weeds had grown tall, moss covered the once proud lanterns, and the pond was murky with fallen leaves. Still, the arrangement of stones, the arch of the bridge, and the sturdy old pine remained the same as when she was a child. Aya knelt on the veranda of the house, her fingers brushing against the worn wood, and felt the warmth of countless evenings spent here with her parents. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the garden. The moonlight spilled across the moss and gravel, revealing shapes that seemed at once familiar and dreamlike. The garden, in the quiet of the night, was alive in a way she had forgotten. The pine's branches whispered. The stones cast shadows that shifted like old memories. She sat by the pond, gazing at the reflection of the moon, and for the first time in years, she wept. The tears were not only for her parents but for the years she had buried away, for the child who once ran laughing through this garden, for the woman who had become lost in the pace of the city. As the tears fell, a single cherry petal, though the season had nearly ended, drifted onto her palm. She stared at it in wonder, as though it were a message carried across time. In the following days, Aya began to tend the garden. Each morning, she swept the moss-covered stones, trimmed the overgrown bushes, and cleared the pond of fallen branches. The work was slow, and her body ached, but she felt an unfamiliar peace with every movement. It was as if the garden responded, sighing with gratitude, revealing its hidden patterns once more. At night, she would sit on the veranda with a cup of tea, watching as the moon climbed into the sky. The quiet garden, bathed in silver light, seemed to hum with voices she could not quite hear. Sometimes she thought she caught the laughter of her father, who used to prune the trees with careful hands. Other times, she felt her mother's presence in the fragrance of the blossoms, gentle and reassuring. One evening, while resting beside the stone lantern, Aya heard footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she expected to find only shadows, but a boy of about 10 stood there, gazing at the pond. His clothes were simple, his face unfamiliar, yet he seemed to belong to the garden as naturally as the pine or the stones. "Who are you?" Aya asked softly. The boy smiled. "I live nearby. I come to see the garden sometimes. It feels quiet here, like it remembers things." Aya's heart tightened. The boy's words mirrored her feelings. She invited him to sit beside her, and together they watched the moonlight dance across the water. He spoke of how his grandmother used to bring him to this place, telling him that the garden held the breath of generations. Aya realized then that she was not alone in her memories. The garden had been a companion to many. From that night, the boy visited often. He helped Aya with the work, carrying stones, pulling weeds, and listening to her stories of the past. In his laughter and curiosity, Aya felt a bridge between what had been and what was yet to come. The garden, once dormant, bloomed anew under their care. As the weeks passed, the moon waxed and waned. Each night, Aya would find herself sitting in the same spot, watching the shifting light transform the garden into something timeless. She began to understand what her parents had once meant when they spoke of the beauty of impermanence. The garden was never the same twice, one night filled with the song of frogs, another with the rustle of leaves, another still with the silent fall of petals across the stones. Summer approached, and with it the cicadas' chorus. The boy no longer came as often, caught up in school and other duties, yet the memory of his presence remained. Aya, too, found herself preparing to leave once more, but with a heart transformed. She knew now that the garden was not a relic of the past but a living thread, connecting all who paused to listen beneath the moonlight. On her final evening, Aya sat by the pond, the moon shining high above. She whispered a promise to return, not to let the garden fade into silence again. A breeze stirred, and petals where they had come from, she could not tell, drifted across the water. She watched them settle gently, as though guided by unseen hands, and smiled. The garden would endure. Its stones, trees, and quiet paths would welcome others, carrying forward the voices of those who had walked there before. And Aya, wherever she went, would carry with her the memory of moonlight over the quiet garden. A reminder that beauty lives not in permanence, but in the fleeting, tender moments that linger in the heart.